Hello everyone. Leading up to this moment was tough, so I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to uncover the day Truong suddenly stopped everything and said, "Not today. You're allowed to be happy," as he took Tieu and Diep out for a rare family trip. But what happened when village gossip tried to ruin their peace? Stay with me to find out. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next video. Truong noticed it before Tieu admitted anything. It wasn't one big moment, no dramatic collapse, no loud complaint. It was the small signs that stacked up quietly, the way fatigue always does. Her eyes stayed tired even after sleep. Her hands moved slower when she washed vegetables. She smiled at Dieu, but the smile didn't fully reach her eyes. And when Truong came home from the market, she would say, "I'm fine," a little too quickly, like she was trying to convince herself more than him. That morning, Truong watched her pour water into a cup. Her fingers trembled just slightly. "Tieu," he said softly. She froze for a second, then turned. "What?" Truong didn't answer right away. He just walked closer, took the cup from her hands, and placed it down carefully. Truong lifted his palm and pressed the back of his fingers gently to her forehead. Not enough to scare her, just enough to check. Her skin wasn't burning hot, but she felt warm, like the kind of warmth that comes from pushing too hard for too long. "Truong, don't. I have things to do." "That's exactly why," Truong said. She blinked. "Why what?" Truong turned toward the window. Outside, the garden waited. The baskets waited. The day waited, always demanding, never patient. "Today," he said calmly. "We're not doing any of that." "What do you mean?" Truong looked back at her, eyes steady. "I mean, you're resting." Her lips parted. "But the market?" "I already took care of it," Truong said. "I went early, sold what I could, and I told the shipper to handle the rest." Tieu's breath caught. "You did that? Alone?" Truong nodded like it was nothing. Like he wasn't also exhausted. "Yes." But Tieu glanced toward the kitchen, toward the laundry, toward the endless list in her head. "There's still so much at home. Dieu needs..." Truong reached up and gently tapped her shoulder, like he was grounding her back to the present. "Dieu needs you healthy." Tieu's eyes softened for a second, but then the worry rushed back in. "We can't waste a day," she whispered. "We're not rich, Truong. We can't." Truong's expression didn't change. His voice stayed quiet, but firm. "Exactly. We're not rich. That's why we can't afford for you to get sick." Tieu swallowed hard, and Truong could tell she was close to arguing again, out of fear, out of habit, out of pride. So he didn't give her room to fight. He turned, walked toward the stove, and started moving like he had a plan. "Sit," he said simply. Tieu hesitated. Truong looked over his shoulder. Not angry, just serious. Tieu knew. That was all it took. She slowly sat on the chair, as if her body had been waiting for permission. From the bedroom, Dieu suddenly came running out, hair messy, eyes bright. "Dad!" he shouted. "Why are you home?" Truong's serious face softened instantly. "I'm fine," Tieu said quickly. Dieu's small face didn't look convinced. He climbed onto the chair beside her and leaned in, studying her like a little doctor. "You look tired," he announced. Tieu tried to laugh, but it sounded thin. "I'm just sleepy." Dieu turned to Truong, like this was urgent news. "Dad, Mum is sleepy. We should let her sleep." Truong nodded, as if Dieu had just given the wisest advice in the world. "That's exactly what we're doing." Dieu's eyes widened. "Really?" Truong smiled. "Really?" Dieu bounced in place. Then, can we go out? Tieu immediately shook her head. No, Tieu. But Truong cut in, calm and gentle. Yes. Both Tieu and Tieu froze at the same time. Tieu stared at Truong. What did you just say? Truong walked closer, grabbed a small towel, dipped it in warm water, and wrung it out. I said yes, he repeated, then placed the warm towel into Tieu's hands. We're going out, he said. All of us. Tieu's voice dropped. But why? Because you haven't breathed in days. Tieu's eyes stung. Truong. Truong stood and turned to Du. Go change. Wear your warm jacket. Du squealed and ran off. Tieu stood up quickly. No, Truong. It's too much. We don't have money for. Truong raised his hand, stopping her gently. Who said anything expensive? Tieu blinked. Truong leaned in and lowered his voice, like he was sharing a secret. Just a small day. A walk. A simple meal. Fresh air. That's all. Tieu's throat tightened. She wanted to say no. She wanted to be responsible. She wanted to protect them from spending. But Truong's eyes held hers with that stubborn tenderness that always made her feel safe and helpless. Truong stepped away and started preparing breakfast. And it wasn't a fancy breakfast, but it was warm. He cracked eggs, stirred rice, heated water with ginger. He placed a bowl in front of Tieu first. Eat. Tieu stared at the bowl. You made this? Truong shrugged. It's not poison. Tieu let out a small laugh, and it surprised even her. Dewey came out dressed like he was going on an adventure jacket, zipped wrong, hair still sticking up. Truong fixed the zipper and patted his head down. Dewey grinned. Dad, where are we going? Truong thought for a second, then said, Somewhere Mom can smile. Tieu looked away fast, pretending something was in her eye. After breakfast, Truong packed a small bag, a bottle of water, a snack for Dewey, a light scarf for Tieu, and without making a big deal of it, a small pack of medicine he'd bought at the market. Tieu noticed it anyway. Truong. He didn't explain. He just slipped it into the bag. Outside, the air was cool. The sun was soft. The world felt quieter than it usually did. As they walked down the village road, Dewey skipped ahead, kicking tiny stones like they were treasures. Tieu walked slower, still cautious, still worried. Truong stayed close, not hovering, just there. Every few steps, he glanced at her face. You okay? He asked. Yes, she whispered. But after a few more minutes, Tieu's breathing changed. She pressed a hand to her chest lightly. Truong noticed immediately. Sit, he said, guiding her toward a low stone near a tree. I'm fine, Truong. Truong knelt in front of her, his hands already opening the water bottle. No, he said quietly. Not fine. Just rest. Dewey ran back, suddenly serious. Mom? Tieu forced a smile. I'm okay. Truong handed her the water, small sips. Tieu drank. The cool water helped, but Truong's focus didn't leave her for a second. Dewey stood close, holding Tieu's sleeve like he was anchoring her to the world. Truong reached into the bag, pulled out the scarf, and placed it gently around Tieu's shoulders. Tieu's eyes widened. You always forget your scarf, Truong said, like it was casual. But it wasn't casual. It was care. It was the kind of care that made Tieu's chest ache, because she wasn't used to being the one protected. After a few minutes, Tieu's color returned a little. Truong stood. Better? She nodded. Dewey looked relieved. Can we keep going? Truong smiled. Slowly. They continued toward the small town park, a modest place with a few trees, a swing set, A tiny pond where people sometimes fed fish. Nothing fancy. But when Du saw the swings, his face lit up like someone had handed him the moon. "Dad! Mum! Look!" He ran to the swing, climbed on, and waited, eyes sparkling like this moment mattered more than any toy. Truong walked behind him and pushed gently. Du laughed. The kind of laugh that made strangers turn and smile. Tunu stood nearby, watching. Her lips curved slowly, like her face remembered how to do it. And for Truong, that single expression was worth more than all the money he'd ever refused. But then, just as the warmth settled in, a familiar voice cut through the air. A woman from the village, passing by with a basket, stopped and stared. Well, she said with a sharp smile. "So you have time to play now?" Tunu's smile froze instantly. Truong's hand stopped on the swing. Dui's laughter faded. Confused, the woman's eyes flicked over Tieu, then over Truong, like she was collecting a story to carry home. Tieu lowered her gaze, shame rising like heat, and Truong slowly turned. "She deserves to rest." The woman blinked, surprised. Truong took one step forward, and "My son deserves to see his mother smile." The woman's mouth opened, but no words came out. The park felt suddenly quiet, and Tunu stared at Truong like she couldn't believe he said that out loud. But Truong wasn't finished. He looked back at Du and pushed the swing again gently, like nothing could shake the peace he was trying to build. Because she knew village gossip never dies, and if that woman carried this moment back to the village, tomorrow might not be peaceful at all. Tunu stood there for a second longer than she meant to, her smile already fading into that familiar tightness in her chest. Truong's words, "She deserves to rest," were still hanging in the air, bold and protective. But what scared her wasn't the woman's face in the park. It was what would happen after. Village talk didn't need proof, it only needed a spark. And Truong had just lit one. The woman with the basket blinked like she didn't know whether to feel offended or embarrassed. Then she forced a laugh, the kind that sounded too sharp to be friendly. "Well, okay," she said, shifting the basket on her arm. "I'm just saying. You know how people are." "That's why I'm saying it clearly," he replied, "so people stop guessing." She looked at Tieu again, as if waiting for her to shrink, but Truong's body was slightly between them now, not blocking, just present. After a moment, the woman turned away, footsteps quick, like she wanted to escape before anyone saw her lose. Tunu let out a shaky breath she didn't realize she was holding. Truong walked back to her and spoke softly, so only she could hear. "Don't look down." Tunu's eyes flickered up. "Truong." Truong shook his head, gentle. "Not today. Today, you're allowed to be happy." Du, still on the swing, had been watching their faces like he could sense the tension. He called out carefully, "Mum, are you okay?" Tunu forced her voice to lift. "I'm okay, sweetheart." Truong smiled at Du. "Keep swinging, buddy." "Higher?" Du's eyes brightened again. "Higher!" Truong pushed the swing once more, steady and controlled. Not too hard, not reckless. Like he was saying without words, "I'm here. I'll keep you safe." Tunu's chest softened. She sat on a nearby bench, hands folded in her lap, watching Truong push Du and laugh when Du squealed. The park wasn't fancy. The swing was rusty. The grass was uneven. But somehow, this felt like a different world from the market's noise and the garden's endless work. She pressed a hand against her ribs, just a small motion, but Truong caught it immediately. His eyes snapped to her face. "Still dizzy?" he asked. "No, just hungry." Truong nodded like he believed her, but he didn't let it go. He walked over, crouched in front of her again like he'd done at home that morning. "Look at me," he said. Tunu hesitated, then met his eyes. Truong's voice lowered. If you feel weak, you tell me. Okay? Tunu's eyes stung. I don't want to ruin the day. Truong's expression softened. You're not ruining anything. The day is for you. Behind them, Tieu hopped off the swing, running over with his cheeks pink from excitement. Dad, Mum, I'm thirsty. Truong stood, opened the bag, and handed Tieu the bottle with a small smile. Small sips. Tieu copied Truong's tone like a tiny adult. Small sips, he repeated seriously, then giggled. Tunu's mouth curved again, and Truong felt it like a reward. Let's eat, Truong said. There's a small place nearby, nothing expensive. Tieu immediately shook her head. Truong, we should just go home and... Truong cut her off gently. No, one bowl of noodles won't break us. Tieu opened her mouth to protest again, but Truong's eyes were warm and stubborn. And it's not a waste, he added. It's medicine for your heart. Tieu froze, because Truong wasn't wrong, so they walked to a small noodle shop near the park. It was the kind of place with plastic stools and a pot steaming behind the counter. The smell alone made Tieu's stomach growl loudly. Tieu clutched Truong's sleeve. Dad, can I get the big bowl? Truong chuckled. You're small. Your bowl is small. Tieu frowned dramatically. But my hunger is big. Tieu let out a real laugh this time, sudden and bright. It startled her, like she forgot she still had that sound inside her. Truong's eyes softened. He looked at her like he was memorizing it. They sat. Truong ordered 2 bowls, one for him, one for Tieu, and a smaller one for Tieu. Then he quietly asked for warm tea. When the tea came, he pushed it toward Tieu immediately. Tieu blinked. You remembered I don't like cold drinks. Truong shrugged. I know you. The bowls arrived, steaming. Tieu grabbed his chopsticks like a warrior. Truong watched him for a second, then looked at Tieu. Eat slowly, he reminded. Tieu nodded, but after a few bites, she stopped and stared at the bowl like it was something rare. Truong asked. Tieu's voice turned small. I feel guilty. Truong's chopsticks paused. For what? For sitting, she admitted. For eating. For... And you work so hard. Truong stared at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and gently touched her hand. Just a brief touch, but steady. Tieu, he said quietly. I rejected a life of wealth. Tieu's breath caught. That sentence always felt heavy when Truong said it out loud like a door he had closed forever. Truong continued, voice calm. Do you know why? Tieu's eyes flickered. Because of us. Yes, Truong said. Because of you. And because of Tieu. Tieu looked up at his name, mouth full. Me? Truong smiled. Yes, you. Then Truong looked back at Tieu, eyes serious again. I didn't reject wealth so we could suffer, he said. I rejected it so we could live without fear. Without people controlling us. Without being forced to smile for someone else. And I can't call this life peaceful, Truong added. If you're always exhausted and always guilty. Tieu's lips trembled. But what if people talk? What if they say, I'm lazy, that I'm using you? Truong's gaze hardened not at her, but at the world. Let them talk, he said simply. Tieu's breath shook. It's easy for you to say. Truong leaned in slightly. But I'm willing, because I chose you. Tieu stared at him like she was hearing those words for the first time. Even though he'd shown them in 1,000 quiet ways, Tieu suddenly reached his small hand across the table and placed it on top of Truong's hand, then on top of Tieu's. His fingers were tiny, but the gesture was big. "We're team," Tieu said proudly, as if he'd just invented the concept. Truong laughed under his breath. Tieunu's tears slipped down, but she was smiling. "We're team." After the noodles, Truong bought Tieu a small treat. Nothing fancy, just a sweet bun. Tieu held it like treasure. Then Truong guided them toward a quiet part of the park, where there were benches under trees. "Sit," he told Tunu again. Softer now. Tunu sat, and Truong stood behind her. "What are you doing?" she asked, confused. Truong's hands gently settled on her shoulders. "I'm going to massage you," he said like it was the most normal thing. Tunu's eyes widened. "Here?" "Here," Truong said. "Why not?" Tieu hopped onto the bench beside Tieu and watched closely, like a supervisor. "Dad," Tieu whispered seriously. "Be gentle." Truong smiled. "I am gentle." His fingers pressed slowly, carefully, releasing knots that had been living in Tieunu's shoulders for weeks. Tieunu's eyes fluttered shut without her permission. Her body melted into the bench like it finally trusted the world. For a moment, everything was quiet. No gossip, no markets, no counting money, just a family breathing. Then Tieunu's voice came out soft, almost embarrassed. "Truong, thank you." Truong's hands paused. "For what?" "For seeing me," she whispered. "Not just the work, not just the chores. Me." Truong's chest tightened. He leaned down slightly, close enough that his words felt like warmth. "I see you every day," he said. "That's why I'm scared when you pretend you're fine." Truong nodded, like he'd been waiting for that truth. "I know," he said. "So, we'll rest." Tieu suddenly leaned his head against Tieunu's arm, sleepy from food and fun. "Mum," he mumbled, "can we do this again?" Tieu looked down at him, heart overflowing. She looked up at Truong, eyes shining. "Yes," she said softly, "we can." Truong smiled, and the smile was peaceful in a way money could never buy. As the sun lowered, Truong helped Tieu stand slowly. He held her hand all the way home. Not because she couldn't walk, but because he wanted the village to see something clearly. She wasn't alone, and as they turned onto the village road, Truong spotted the same woman from earlier across the way. Watching, Truong didn't flinch. He only squeezed Tieunu's hand a little tighter,